Okay, well, my clock says 10 o'clock, so good morning and welcome to the webinar, everyone. My name is Carrie Berger, and I'm the Associate Program Leader for Oregon State University's Forestry and Natural Resource Extension Program. And on May 18th, I begin my new role as a Fire Program Manager for the Extension Fire Program. One of the objectives of the Fire Program is to provide education and outreach opportunities to all of Oregon. Hosting webinars, especially during this difficult time of COVID, is just one way we can accomplish that. So you are tuning in to the first ever Fire Program webinar. This webinar is part of a series of webinars we are providing on wildfire preparedness and prevention in the month of May. Today, we are focusing on wildfire awareness. Coming up, we'll focus on fire behavior, embers, the home ignition zone, fire-adapted communities, and also what it means to be prepared by Ready, Set, Go. So if you haven't already registered for these webinars, please do. Okay, so we have a great lineup of speakers, and I'll take just a minute to introduce them to you right now. Presenting first, we have Daniel Lavelle. Daniel is an extension forester in Klamath and Lake counties. Good morning, Daniel.
Good morning, Carrie.
Next up, we have Mike Tody. Mike is the district forester for the Oregon Department of Forestry in the West Oregon District. Hey, Mike.
Good morning.
And we also have with us today Kristen Babbs. Kristen is the president and CEO of Keep Oregon Green. Hey, Kristen.
Hello.
So welcome all you speakers. We're so glad to have you with us today. Okay, so before we dive into the presentations, there's just a couple of housekeeping items we should discuss before getting started. First off, your audio has been muted, so please type any questions you have for the speakers in the Q&A window. Q&A can be found at the bottom portion of your screen and is labeled Q&A. I will be recording this webinar and will post it on the Fire Program website and the Forestry and Natural Resource Extension YouTube channel. Don't worry about taking notes or trying to remember the website names. I'll provide you with a list of resources in a follow-up email, including a link to the Fire Program website and information on upcoming webinars, including registration. Finally, I will be using the polling function to ask you all a couple of questions throughout the webinar. When I launch a poll, a window should pop up and you should be able to click your answers. If a window does not pop up, then go to the polling option found at the bottom portion of your screen and enable the polling function. So let's see here about just diving right in to our first poll. So I've just launched that poll. There are 3 questions, and you might have to scroll down to see all of the questions. Again, if you're having trouble accessing the poll, see the toolbar at the bottom portion of your screen. There should be a icon for polls, and go ahead and click that and enable the poll. So some of the things we want to know from you all are, where are you from? Tell us a little bit about yourself. Are you a woodland owner? Are you an agency professional? And how many acres of forest land do you own or manage? So we'll wait just a minute as those come in. It looks like most of our attendees are from the Valley. Oh, and as soon as I said that, Southwest Oregon is creeping up, and I will share the results here with you just in a minute. A lot of woodland owners. Okay, just another couple of seconds. Get your answers in if you haven't already done so. I'm going to close the poll here in just a minute, less than a minute. Answers are still coming in. I'm excited to share.
Yeah, it's nice.
Okay, I'm going to end the poll. Here we go. So let's see here, Daniel.
Yeah.
So most are from the Valley, a big crew from Southwest Oregon. Yep. And
Not
let's
many
see.
from the coast.
No, not many from the coast. Some from outside of the USA.
Hmm.
That's interesting. I
Wow.
wonder where they're from.
Yeah.
Some from Washington. Fantastic. Well, welcome everybody.
Hmm.
Most of you are woodland owners or, oh, actually other. And so I'm guessing that might just be general public. Um, and most do not own or manage forest land.
Huh.
Great. Well, thank
Yeah.
you for sharing that
Yeah. Neat.
information. I'm going to stop sharing. And at this point, Daniel, tell
Huh.
us, what is the fire problem? What's going on?
Okay. Well, let's talk about that. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity. And I want to go into this PowerPoint. Hopefully, I can do that. So, what is the problem? Well, it's this. As we have been experiencing over the last 2 months, change is one of the great constants in our lives. And change can bring stress and it can build strength. It can give us problems, but it can also give us opportunities. So the wildfire problem is essentially change in climate. And since climate has been measured worldwide consistently since 1880, that's the standard record we use. The last 6 years have been the hottest years on record going back to 1880, 140 years. That is is one of the changes we're dealing with. Population since that time, since 1880, has gone from 50 million in the U.S. to 331 million now, or the latest census, and those people, all of them, need a place to live, and they're choosing to live in areas that have been remote for a long period of time. Gatlinburg, Tennessee, Malibu, Santa Rosa, Paradise, all in areas in greater densities than ever before. And with that, the other change is that most of the wildland fires throughout our history have been lightning caused in the West. And now the majority of them are human caused, obviously, because of all the density of human population, residences, and everything else in areas that have been previously very remote. And management practices of forest environments have changed over that period of time since the 1880s. Some of the largest fires in the country's history were between 1880 and 1910. But since that time, since active fire suppression, biomass, tree densities have built, biomass has accumulated, and and shrubs have outgrown their carrying capacity, the productive carrying capacity of the land, and there's been a huge amount of mortality, stress, mortality, insect and disease, all across the country into Alaska. And these conditions build up the fuels, build up the biomass, dead fuels, and with our fine record of fire suppression, and we're very good at doing that, 98% effective of putting out all fire starts. That adds up, and with managing by not managing and managing by fire suppression, we have created a biomass problem. The other change are the boxes of fuel we live in. These boxes of fuel have been built at greater densities, uh, spread out, bigger subdivisions in these more remote areas than ever before. And with that, um, let's see if I can get into that. With that, the other change that's very significant and I won't show the entirety of this video, but the other change is these boxes of fuel have within them furnishings and construction materials that 30 or 40 years ago were made primarily out of organic matter, organic materials, solid wood, real wood, cottons, wools, draperies, furnishings. All of that was pretty much organic material. And recently, all the furnishings are more synthetics, glues, and laminates. And where we used to have 30 minutes before an interior fire behavior called flashover occurred, where a flashover is a fire behavior condition in an interior where everything heats up to an extent about 1,000 to 1,500 degrees, where everything in that interior spontaneously combusts in flames. We used to have, with traditional materials, building materials, furnishings, we used to have 30 minutes to respond to a fire, to check it out before that condition of flashover, which is not safe to enter, occurred. Now, with synthetics, with glues, with laminates, with synthetic construction materials and synthetic furnishings, that flashover occurs in 3 minutes or less anymore. That's inside a building. So that, I won't play all of this video, but what they did a comparison study, and they actually ignited a modern room with modern furnishings to a legacy room with organic furnishings and timed it out. And indeed, that flashover occurred in 3 minutes in the modern room and 30 minutes in the legacy room. The other change that's occurring more often with human-caused fires being the most predominant, human-caused fires can occur anytime during the year when conditions are right to burn, or dry enough or hot enough. It doesn't matter. It's not just during the lightning season or the stormy season anymore. It's during the year, earlier in the year and later in the year. And with that, because of climate change, we're now getting more red flag days where temperatures exceed 80 degrees, wind is greater than 20 miles per hour, and humidity, air moisture, is less than 20%. We are achieving those red flag days more often during the year, earlier in the year, and later in the year. So the problem is, basically, it's all of it together. It's a web of change. It's a web of change with everything together, coming together and creating the problem.
So Daniel, it's not just the biomass alone. It's not climate change alone. It's not us. It's the interaction of all that happening is why we have such a huge problem on our hands.
It's a web of change. It's a web. It's all of that intersecting together, giving us the real wildfire problem we're having right now.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Well, thank you for that presentation and enlightening us to what the problem is. And so now I'm really curious to hear from Mike from the Oregon Department of Forestry what the outlook for the fire season in Oregon is. I mean, I can see out my window right now, and last night, I mean, it's super windy and it's supposed to be really warm today. What does that mean?
Well, I was listening to Daniel's presentation there and starting to get worried already. So, and I appreciate that. And we've got, I'm sitting here in Philomath, Oregon here on this warm, sunny, windy morning and thinking about fire season coming up here and where we're at. So Carrie's asked me to kind of cover 3 different areas, kind of where we're at right now in terms of the conditions across the state and Oregon, what we're thinking about for fire season coming up here, and then last, some potential impacts that we're already trying to manage around and through with COVID-19 and what that means to all the firefighting agencies and cooperators that are out there. So let's get started here. So I've got a number of slides I'll just share with you here. In general, you'll see a theme here, folks. In general, green is good and red, not so much. So what we're looking at here is essentially, if we look at the water weather year, it starts on October 1st in Oregon. This is information tracked and compiled by the Natural Resource Conservation Service. And the numbers you're seeing there are basically the percent of average. This information here is about a week old, so this was from last Friday, May 1st. And you'll see that Northeast Oregon is in pretty good shape there. It's green. The Willamette region, Northern Cascades here in Oregon, and Deschutes Basin are fair, I would say. And highlighting specifically the whole, basically across the southern part of the state here is already starting out pretty dry for this year. In particular, we're seeing the Southwest Oregon, South Central Oregon, I think are probably going to be some spots that we're most concerned with, at least initially coming into fire season here. So what does this mean, and how does this translate into fire conditions, fuel conditions here in Oregon for us? So I just thought I'd share this with you. Don't get too concerned about all the fine details on this. I just want to use an example. So this is a graph of a 1,000-hour fuel moisture. So a 1,000-hour fuel are those larger fuels we look at, and I like to look at these because the larger fuel moistures kind of give us a nice, more of a trend analysis, if you will. The graph we're looking at here, the far left is the 1st of May, and the far right is the end of October, which is kind of the bookends around a traditional Oregon fire season. The darkest line you see through the center is essentially kind of the average fuel moisture. So this is information for Southwest Oregon, and it's compiled from information around pretty much Jackson, Josephine County in there. So, and like most of the state, you'll see this. So fuels start off moist and wet here in the early spring period. As we move, the photo period gets longer, we get longer days, it gets warmer and drier, and then long about in August is typically around the state when fuel moistures are at their lowest. These are dead fuel moistures and even live fuel moistures for that matter. And then as we move into September, hopefully the fall rains start in October and you see those fuel moistures start to increase again. The thing I just thought I would point out here, if you look at the very left-hand part of this screen there, you see a little red line there, and that's the current fuel moistures in Southwest Oregon, and you see they are well below average already. So that is of a concern here. So if we start considering more the current fire conditions around here, by the end of April, we had already had over 100 fires in Oregon. And that's actually over 3 times our average. So we're not on a very good start here. And in some places of the state, like Southwest Oregon, the conditions are already getting pretty bad. And in fact, last week, a week ago, May 1st, the Southwest Oregon District went into fire season already for 2020. The conditions aren't like that elsewhere around the state. You remember looking back there in Northeast Oregon, the fuel moisture situation is considerably better there. It's considerably better here on the West Oregon District that I have responsibility for as well. So one other point I would make here when we start talking about precipitation and fuel moistures, this isn't the first year this has happened. We've had a series of years, and so I'll just kind of share some local information for you. There's a lot of folks from the Willamette Valley I saw on the call here today. So our Dallas unit office, typically by this time of year, would have over 47 inches of rain from October 1st until now. We're about 14 and a half inches better than that, actually below average just in Dallas. So even here in the Willamette Valley, not a very good picture to start with, and we've had several years in a row of below average precipitation. So what does that mean when we have multiple years of below average precipitation. Well, the D word comes up, and I'm not talking Dallas here, we're talking drought. This is information from the National Weather Service, and the brown there is where we've already been in a drought condition, or they call it drought persists. The yellow across Oregon there is where they're saying drought development is likely, so the situation's getting worse there. The thing that is not depicted on this graph here, or this chart, is another trend that they talk about called drought intensification. And that's essentially, in a lot of those brown areas, it's not just a persistent drought, it's actually getting worse in some of those cases there. Once again, specifically in South Central and Southwest Oregon, those seem to be the worst spots for us right now. Okay, so that kind of sets the stage on where we're at right now. There's some folks that use a lot of models. They work for an outfit called Predictive Services, and that's basically they apply all this existing information and inferences about where we think we're going to go, and we start predicting what we think is going to happen for the rest of fire season, or as they call it, wildland fire potential outlook. And they report on this every month at the first of the month, and we get a 3 or 4 month kind of forecast, if you will, on what we think is coming up in front of us. So once again, remember, green is good, red, not so good. And right now in Oregon, they're predicting, for significant wildland fire potential, average, nothing better than usual or worse than usual, and that's not too unexpected. We're on the early part of the year here, or we're in the midst of what we call green up, and so there's lots of good fuel moisture out there, things have greened up, and the fire potential is not that bad. So as we move into June, been talking about Southwest Oregon, and here Southwest Oregon pops up. That's, from my perspective, in the 3 decades I've spent with the agency here, that's early. So typically, we don't get too concerned about significant wildland fire potential until the latter part of June, hopefully even July. Some predictions, just with the conditions that we talked about already that we're seeing, June could fire up. So traditionally, when we move into the latter part of the summer, this is getting towards the peak parts of fire season for us. And you see here in July that basically starts encompassing most of the state. Look at Northeast Oregon there. That was green on that earlier graph we looked at, and hence it's kind of holding through here. And I probably don't even need to share this, but I will anyways. You all know what August is going to look like. August is the peak of fire season for us here in Oregon. And this is at least a prediction now, and once again, they'll continue to update this, but these are the types of information that we look at as we're preparing for fire season, not just within the Department of Forestry, but all the wildland fire agencies around the state and all of our cooperators in paying attention to this. So the last thing, with all that wonderful news there, been asked to just talk about a little bit about what are the impacts to the wildland fire agencies from COVID-19, and how are we responding to this pandemic out there. The Department of Forestry has basically kind of broken this into 3 buckets, if you will. The first being, how are we preparing for fire season, onboarding our people, getting ready for this. The second is initial attack, and initial attack is just that the first initial response to a wildland fire, report a fire, and how we go about addressing that and attacking those fires. Extended attack is everything beyond that. So fire season readiness and preparedness for us has been so different this year from what we're accustomed to, and we've got pretty much a set playbook that we've used from year to year in terms of onboarding people, preparing our equipment, lining out information and getting things set, and it has all changed for us this year. Just the same as this, we're using so much video conferencing, distancing for everything. So as an example, my district is typically one of several districts and several agencies that participates in what we call the Mid-Willamette Valley Interagency Fire School. That's where we put all our firefighters basically into a classroom and field settings to do pre-season training and refresher training, and obviously we can't do that this year. So fire school has been canceled. All that training is being done online and remotely, and then we're trying to field test and verify that folks have those skill sets and are familiar with the equipment and know what to do to keep themselves safe and aggressively fight fires. So a number of things like that going on. Obviously, other types of preparedness, you know, we have a whole host of personal protective equipment, PPE, that we use, and now we're adding to that, right, with masks and things of that nature, implementing all the protocols from CDC on cleaning our equipment and sterilizing those things. So big lift there on the front end. I think we've been addressing that pretty well. Time will tell how that goes. Initial attack, the next one there, as we consider how the Department of Forestry typically attacks fires, we're primarily what we call an engine outfit. So we use fire engines there. I actually think of the three things that I have depicted here on the screen, the three buckets. Initial attack is still, we're going to do pretty well there. I think we've got workarounds to socially distance our folks, limit their exposure, but still keep resources going. Perhaps a little heavier reliance on aircraft now than we normally would if they're available. But initial attack, I think we're going to do okay on. We're talking about concepts of basically keeping people in modules, if you will, so that they're not interacting with others. And so if something were to happen and folks were to get sick, we can isolate them from the rest of our staff and the rest of the firefighting community out there to try and address some of those concerns. The last one, and the one that we're talking about the most, and probably for me at least is one of the bigger concerns, is around extended attack. And so extended attack can be anywhere from a couple of days to several weeks. And so if you think about the chances of a large fire getting going and some of those things that we've seen in the past there, typically what you'll see in Oregon is we'll deploy an incident management team to those. A little mini city will actually spring up there with all the resources and all the people that we'll bring in to address or attack that fire. And so let me paint a little picture for you there. Suddenly you're bringing in people from all over the state, perhaps all over the country, maybe even from outside the country, and putting them all in close proximity to one another for weeks on end. You're feeding them together, they're sleeping together, they're working in a high-stress environment. Personal hygiene is a real challenge in those situations. They're working long hours in stressful conditions, so fatigue is a situation there, and you basically start looking at a picture there about the worst case scenario for trying to prevent some sort of infectious disease spread. So we are readdressing virtually every component of that in terms of how we're going to brief people instead of having them in large gatherings there that might be done remotely, how we're going to order resources, which resources are going to be coming around, and how we're going to use those, how we're going to feed people, where are we going to sleep those, all those types of things and components that are necessary on those large campaign type fires or project fires as we call those. That's going to be a real big challenge for us to address. So my take home message for folks is initial attack is always important. And you heard Daniel talk about, we've been pretty successful at that throughout the West here, not just in Oregon there, and keeping most of those fires small. A large, prolonged fire that's going to need extended resources for extended attack is going to be a real challenge for us this year. And so initial attack is going to be even more important. And reflecting back to fire season 2019, the largest fire the Department of Forestry had last year, largest and most expensive, was a human-caused fire. And we need to do everything we can to avoid those situations this year. So hopefully that's a little bit of a lead-in for Chris, and that's what I have to share with you here this morning.
Great. Thank you so much, Mike. And, you know, you're right. We cannot control lightning caused fires, but we can control what we as humans do. And so I'm grateful that Kristen Babbs is online with us today from Keep Oregon Green. And Chris, would you mind telling us a little bit about, I'm getting the website here ready to share. What is Keep Oregon Green?
Thank you for that. Keep Oregon Green is a nonprofit, and I might just add there that we thrive off of membership contributions and donations. But we've been around since 1941, and essentially we fight fires with publicity. So obviously a fire prevented is a fire that we don't have to put out, that we don't have to spend tens or even hundreds of thousands of dollars to put out. We can avoid that initial attack and extended attack situation that Mike was talking about. Our mission is that we promote healthy landscapes and safe communities by educating the public of our shared responsibility to prevent human-caused wildfires. And we're in the midst of Wildfire Awareness Month right now. So we're working with other federal and state agencies, other organizational partners to promote programs and messages and tips to help prepare folks, prepare your properties, prepare your homes for the upcoming fire season, and to help prevent human-caused wildfires. And I may do a little shameless plug here that folks may have seen the new Smoky Bear license plate that's out there on the roadways. And so for those of you who have those on your vehicles, not only are you serving as a mobile billboard for prevention and awareness, you're also contributing to Keep Oregon Green at the same time and helping us spread the prevention word.
That's great. Thanks, Chris. So we've heard about the outlook for the fire season 2020. What is Keep Oregon Green concerned about this year?
So in Oregon, it's people, not lightning, who start the most fires on the landscape. In fact, 2/3 of our wildfires are human caused, and a majority of those happen near the home. So it's good to see that we've got some landowners on the webinar here. We're really concerned about the safety of our firefighters at a time when we're facing a pandemic and a deepening statewide drought, as Mike alluded to. The smoke impacts are going to challenge even those of us with the healthiest pair of lungs, but we are very concerned about folks with the underlying health issues or those recovering from COVID. So we really want to think about those smoke impacts as a offshoot of wildfire. But the other thing is that we may be facing a lack of resources this summer. That could be very likely. So we'd rather have firefighters be able to focus their attention on the lightning fires and not be needlessly diverted away from those fires by us adding to their burden, by forcing them to respond to careless human-caused fires. Lightning fires can't be prevented, but people fires can.
Right. And I think, and Mike can jump on and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Oregon Department of Forestry had asked people to stop their pile burnings, as well as some of the agencies who typically do prescribe burning during this time of year to help mitigate the risk by minimizing the fuels. They've actually stopped that too, so that they don't contribute to smoke in the air and those at risk and those with COVID. That's important considerations to think about. Smoke.
We did a lot of, it was a multi-agency press release that went out on April 3rd, and we've asked all landowners, property owners to voluntarily hold off on burning right now due to the smoke impacts related to COVID and the quickly drying conditions, especially this weekend. So the best thing to do right now is just cover your piles and wait. Yeah. Wait until the rain comes next fall. Wait until the conditions are safer to burn, and we're all going to be in better shape.
Yeah, yeah. So I think I heard Mike say that in April there was over 100 fires already, and so I'm curious, what are the top 3 causes of wildfires each year?
There are so many common everyday activities that can start a wildfire, but the top 3 ways that wildfires start in Oregon typically are the escaped or rekindled backyard burn piles, and then that usually flips spots with equipment fires. So you're looking at lawnmowers, chainsaws, vehicles. They fall into that equipment category, and then abandoned campfires or open fires, maybe even warming fires if you're a hunter. So there's one district that's in fire season right now, and that's down in the Southwest. I just want to say quickly that the declaration of fire season means no burning of backyard debris piles, no burning of debris in burn barrels, no fireworks, no tracer ammunition, and no exploding targets. And then just a reminder too that sky lanterns are prohibited year-round in Oregon.
Yep.
So yeah, we mentioned the fact that we want to ask people to hold off on the debris burning for now. Please wait. So I think we can tackle the debris burning part of it. That's typically the #1 cause of fires in Oregon. And then equipment fires, those are usually started by vehicles, tractors, harvesters, chainsaws, weed eaters, lawnmowers, like I mentioned, motorcycles, ATVs, you could throw those in there too. But vehicles, when we look at our database, those are usually the biggest issue in the equipment category. Think about an escaped carbon particle from a muffler, or dry grass in contact with the hot exhaust system or the catalytic converter on your vehicle. That may be all it takes to start off, to touch off a wildfire. And then for the equipment that you use around your home, we just ask that you use the right tool for the job at the right time. So always call first to find out if equipment use is being restricted in your area. Everybody that's on this webinar right now, you're all in a different address zone, and your fire restrictions are going to be different depending on where you are in the state. So, you know, during the summertime, dry fuels are really susceptible to a spark from a steel blade striking a rock, or sparks emitted from a hot exhaust system. So it's really important that you know, be aware of when you're using equipment. Typically the best time to do that is early in the morning when the temperatures are low and humidity is high. That's kind of the best time to do that. Mm-hmm. And then for that third cause, campfires or open fires, you know, I really try to promote using a camp stove. Kicking the campfire habit this summer is probably going to be in our favor. And portable cooking stoves that use those liquefied or bottled fuels are a safer option for campfires at any time of year. And even in the areas that prohibit campfires outside of the maintained campgrounds with those established fire pits, those often allow the use of portable stoves. So those are ways to kind of tackle those top 3 issues that I just mentioned.
Mm-hmm. So Daniel talked about that red flag warning. Should people be out with their lawnmower mowers or have equipment out and running during a red flag warning?
Definitely not. And again, it's important, you know, Northwest Oregon is going to look very different in terms of their fire environment and conditions than they are in Southwest. So we can't just blanket a message across the state, and that's definitely our challenge. But that's why we're asking people to check locally with their local ODF district office, with their local fire department, with their local air authority, to make sure that we're following regulations and restrictions as they apply to your local area.
That's important, the local part.
Yep.
Chris, what are some other causes of fire that people might not be aware of besides the ones you just mentioned?
It could be, you know, in the summertime, smoking can start fires. That's typically not a huge cause for us. It's almost like you have to have the stars aligned in that situation, that the temperature has to be hot enough, the humidity has to be low enough for a cigarette to touch off a fire, but they do. And it's kind of aggravating to see people driving down the highways and throwing them out of their vehicles. So, you know, when fire conditions are severe, a thoughtless flick of any smoking material can start a fire. So we ask people to dispose of smoking materials in a deep, sturdy ashtray. Don't do it on the ground. Don't put it in bark mulch or dry vegetation. Make sure that they're completely extinguished, and use water or sand. Maybe even keep a can. If you're a smoker, keep a can in your car full of water and extinguish it in your car. They don't come with ashtrays anymore, which is kind of challenging, but target shooting can start fires. Recreational shooting, if the vegetation is really dry, the hot fragments of a spent bullet can land in vegetation, smolder, and ignite. The Pit 36, if anybody remembers that fire back in Estacada a few years back, that was an example of a target shooting fire. And there are restrictions on the types of targets and ammunition that can be used during fire season. So it's important, again, to check, you know, seek permission from the landowner, check the rules and regulations in your area that you're visiting. Other things include fireworks, just a whole host of things that if you can imagine it sparking or,
Right.
or you know, catching fire, it probably will.
Right. So what do you want Oregonians to think about as they move into doing their activities this summer?
You know, conditions change. In fact, we're coming into a changing condition this weekend. We're going to get high temperatures today and tomorrow, and then it's going to change on Monday. So just for your safety, stay informed on the current and predicted conditions in your community or in your area, and be prepared when you're out enjoying the outdoors. There are certain activities that are going to be banned or prohibited or restricted in Oregon during fire season or year-round due to the risk of fire. So just really know the restrictions, whether you're at home, whether you're at work or at play. And you can find those by going to our website, going to keeporegongreen.org. We have a current conditions page for information on the latest news and restrictions. There's a map there that we link to on the, it's Oregon Department of Forestry's Fire Restrictions and Regulated Use Notification Map. And we carry that on our page. You can stay up to date on our Facebook and Twitter accounts. So go to these two pages, go to ODF, go to KOG, bookmark these two sites, and you should be in good shape. You know, so predictable is preventable.
Sorry. What's that?
I was just going to say, predictable is preventable. If you can predict the outcome of your behavior, if you think what you're doing might create a spark that could touch off a fire, find an alternative activity, reschedule that activity to a less fire-prone time, day of the day or of the year. And I would say the most important thing to do right now is create defensible space around your property, around your home, within 5 to 30 feet of the home. Clearing that space of flammable material is critical, because that way, if you accidentally start a fire, it can't spread to your neighbors and then the neighboring forest land, and then you've got a good buffer in case of an oncoming fire or in case of embers, which can fly ahead of the fire a mile or more. And I'm going to promote Firewise. If you go to firewise.org, this is a great program. And just keep in mind that you can do what you can do around your home, but if you're only thinking about your home and you're not working with your neighbors and they're not creating defensible space around their homes, you're just as vulnerable.
Right. And actually, that is a beautiful segue into letting these folks online know that next week, Friday at 1 o'clock, we are going to be diving into the home ignition zone. So that 30 feet out from your home to 100 to 200 feet, and looking at what people can do in each of those zones. And so that's really important. We're going to talk about embers and fire behavior. And then the Friday after that, we'll talk about fire adapted communities and being what it means to be ready, set, go, having your go bags. And so that's really important. And Firewise is a really good resource. I pulled up here on your Keep Oregon Green website, the current conditions, the stay informed, so people can see that shared screen. Like I said, don't worry about trying to write down all these websites. I will provide all of these resources, Keep Oregon Green, Firewise, ODF, in a follow-up email to you all, either later today or Monday morning. So again, don't worry about copying down all these addresses. I'll have that for you. So I'm just going to pop up real quick here. Hopefully you all can see that. That's information for next week's webinar, again, on fire behavior, embers, risk assessment, and then diving into the home ignition zone. Okay, so a lot of questions have come up, and that's fantastic. What I want to do quickly here, if I can figure this out, I'm going to launch just one more poll, and that's an evaluation poll. So here I go, I've launched it. And basically, this is just, it helps us the information you provide helps us to just make the next webinars that much better. They're just two simple questions. Overall, what's your satisfaction with today's webinar, and will you use the information you learned about today in your work or your leisure? And so that's really important for us to understand that. Okay, let's see here. I've got a bunch of questions, and I'll just let that poll go. So if speakers, you want to come back online, There we go. So let's see the time. We have about 15 minutes. We'll see if we can get these questions answered. The speakers have told me they're willing to stay on an extra 15 minutes if we don't get these questions answered in our allotted time. So I really appreciate that. These are all really great questions. Mike, going back to talking about COVID and the response, I have a question here. Someone is specifically interested in how the community will be protected from the coronavirus with firefighters coming in from all parts of the state and nation should we have a mega fire. And I know you talked about the firefighters and the firefighter community, but what about those communities that the firefighters go into? How can communities protect themselves?
So two things that are being discussed right now. We're actually thinking that, the movement of firefighters around the United States or perhaps bringing firefighters in from Canada, other places that we've done in the past on these larger type fires, we're going to see that pretty restricted this year. And that's two things. We're going to limit that movement of people around the nation and around the country. The flip side of that, obviously, those are really critical resources that we depend on those large fires there, and we're not going to have that available perhaps like we normally would. The other thing in terms of the interaction of the firefighters themselves in and around communities where there's a fire camp or the fire itself, obviously when there's an ongoing fire, we're trying to separate the public and firefighters just for safety perspectives. Some things, this hasn't been decided yet, but I talked a lot about the fire camp situation there and how we're going to basically contain folks within those areas. They call it a closed fire camp, so public can't go in and out, and we don't want firefighters to go in and out. That's going to represent some challenges for us there in terms of how do we keep people fed, how do we give them a good spot to sleep. If you're a firefighter that is on night shift, so they start at 7 p.m. and work till 7 a.m. That means they're going to sleep in the middle of the day. How do we provide those folks some sort of situation, typically where they can get some quality rest in those prolonged years there? And so we're going to have to look at those things quite closely there, and that's going to be a challenge for us.
Mm-hmm. So, Mike, you mentioned in April there was already 100 fires. How many of the 2020 reported fires were human set?
So if we look at what we call these shoulder seasons, so if we think back to that fuel moisture graph there, the times early in the spring or later in the fall, just about all of those are human caused. And that's essentially, you heard Chris talk about there's kind of the two primary categories for starting a fire. They're either human caused or they're lightning. And typically we don't see lightning fires until hopefully at least until late June. It really starts to peak about the middle of July and in through August, and typically by September those lightning fires start to wane, or if we get them they come really wet, so it's not an issue. So all those fires, that 100 plus fires that we've had already, are all human caused, and likely a lot of those, our biggest causes of fire in those shoulder seasons are debris burning or backyard burning as we call it.
And which you're asking folks not to do at this point, given our conditions and also because of COVID, correct?
Yes, basically for two perspectives, trying to not to admit the smoke right now in your neighborhood, in and around there, and now obviously with the fire danger starting to creep up there. Chris also talked about, once we officially declare fire season, then we'll start to regulate that, and that puts us in a different arena. Got
it. So, I'm not sure who to direct this to, maybe Daniel, but are there any efforts in our state or federal forests to convert the excess biomass that you talked about, or the fuel buildup, into biochar to be used in agriculture? This would be an effective carbon sequestration solution.
Well, in our landscape efforts in Klamath and Lake County, we looked into that issue because we're creating and doing successful management practices on forest and range and farmland. You create a lot of biomass, mountains of biomass. And we looked into biochar, we've looked into other utilization practices. And to be really honest, a limiting factor to biochar specifically is economics. You know, it's we haven't come up with a way yet to make it economically viable to treat all of that without subsidizing, getting grant money, then getting equipment, getting expertise. I mean, it's quite, it has great promise, and theoretically, it can do a lot of good, but right now we've found that it just isn't economically feasible to do, but we're still working on it.
Mm-hmm.
And there are other efforts too. There's testing going on. Forest Service has a regional biomass coordinator that's working on that. And I think the biggest potential would be for these big landscape efforts that could acquire some subsidization grant money to augment the utility of it, because I think it has great promise.
Absolutely. Kristen, could you tell us again how equipment can cause a fire? And with that, what about battery-driven power tools like weed eaters and chainsaws? Are those also a problem?
It's usually the motorized, the gas powered equipment that we're concerned about. So, you know, think about, you know, refueling something when it's hot, or, you know, things that can emit sparks. Those are the things that we're concerned about. So, you know, maintaining a clean exhaust system, making sure that you equip those gas power tools with a spark arrestor. Those are the kinds of things that we're concerned about. But, you know, like a weed eater, I mentioned earlier about, you know, whirling metal blades striking a rock as you're working, and that can spark a fire. So maybe switch over to a plastic line weed eater. There are simple adjustments that you can make for equipment to avoid sparking a fire. Battery powered, we're not concerned about.
If I could add something too, like logging equipment, when I was working in the woods, a lot of fires were started, and not necessarily commercially. I mean, just getting firewood when a cable is yarding in material, strikes a rock, like Kristen is saying, creates sparks, causes fire. And I've seen motorcycles without those spark arresters causing fires, although some do have them on there. I've seen vehicles cause fires, going that hot crankcase going over dry grass on a back road, causing a fire. There's a lot of ways when it's hot, dry enough, when those red flag conditions occur, there's a lot of ways sparks can cause a fire.
So can I jump in here and just say that you are your own first line of defense, and you're going to need to be able to react quickly to put out a fire if you start one. So just, you know, always make sure that you've got a charged water hose on hand, at least a bucket of water or a fire extinguisher on hand. You know, and if you see something, if you see smoke, you know, it's usually good to stay on site, you know, after an hour after whatever it is that you're doing. So if you see smoke, you can respond to it quickly and put it out. But, you know, you've got 911 at your fingertips in case anything happens and gets out of control.
And don't hesitate to dial 911 if it's gotten to that point. I think some people get scared and nervous, and so don't hesitate. So in a new house, and so just so you all know, I'm taking these questions and answers just as they come and just reading them directly. In a new house construction, what is the best practices for fire prevention? Of those practices, which is most important, specifically a new small subdivision near forest land?
I saw that one. If I can respond to that, I saw that one. So definitely stay tuned for the next May 15th webinar, because Jenna Trentadue will be on and talking about the Firewise program. But if you go to firewise.org, I myself am a landowner. I own about 62 acres, and we're going to be building a home on it. So that's a great question. I've handed my construction guy, there, if you go to firewise.org, they have a home Firewise checklist for construction, and they also have a Firewise checklist for landscaping. So you can download those materials, hand them to your builder, and there are other neighborhoods out there. In Bend, I believe, over in Central Oregon, there's a new neighborhood called Tree Farm, and I think there are a few others over there that are Firewise from the ground up, from the very beginning, from the construction stages. So there are other communities out there that you can check with and find out, what they're doing, who they're working with, and how to, make that new neighborhood Firewise from the ground up, from the very beginning.
And if I can throw in a pitch that's not on any of the sites, and I think it's really important, if building a new house, if you have the $3,000 or $5,000 to build into it a sprinkler system in the house, that would buy you significant amount of time, that it would delay that flashover significantly to do something about it. To me, if you're building a new home, if you look at solar energy, if you look at all of the investments you're making, to me, that's a very important investment. If you could build it into your construction costs, that will have tremendous payoff later on.
That's a great tip, Daniel. And the State Fire Marshal's office would have information about that.
They would. They would.
Well, along the same lines here, in a small subdivision, are there trees, plants to avoid planting, or are there trees that actually are less fire susceptible?
I've been talking a lot, Daniel. Do you want to take that one? You've got a great publication.
Kristen, no, you're talking really well, and I'm glad you are. But their extension, FNR extension, has a publication that, yes, there are plants that are fire resistant. There are plants that are fire susceptible. If you look at plants like juniper and ceanothus, and those are born to burn. They're born to ignite hot and burn hot, and that's what their goal in life is. And you don't want to plant them next to your house. But there are other plants like some vaccinium, some false huckleberry, that are actually fire resistant, and they're adapted to grow on cooler, shadier areas in the wild, and they have beautiful flowers, and they have good foliage, and they can actually resist a fire. Nothing's immune, of course, but this publication, and Carrie, if you may please send everyone a link to that.
I absolutely will.
We'll give the recommended plants, grass, shrub, tree, forb, to be fire resistant for creating. You can have a nice landscape if you're Firewise. You can have that, but you have to be wise about it.
Yeah.
And this will help.
I wrote myself a little note that when I send you all an email, part of the resources that I'll send is that publication that Daniel talked about.
Great.
So will reduced state tax revenue due to COVID impact our ability to prevent and combat forest fires? And I'm not sure who wants to take that, if Mike or...
I'll
throw that to Mike.
I'll take a shot at this one. And I saw that question, and so that is a rapidly developing conversation right now. And if we look at how we fund wildland fire from the Oregon Department of Forestry, general fund is a big part of that funding picture there, and those are some conversations going on. We haven't been mandated to do anything yet, but we are certainly working through some exercises and kind of trying to figure out what are the things that we might be able to do. None of our budgets are what I would call flush or plump at all. So we're kind of running skin and bones a lot of the time anyways, but is there something we can defer for a year or something like that? And we'll try and do everything we can to mitigate not reducing staff, not reducing firefighters, not reducing fire equipment. But that picture remains to be seen, and that's a real issue and a real concern that we're going to have to grapple with.
Yeah. I think we answered this next question a little bit, but just to say it out loud here, is ODF and industry looking to adjust tactics to include early season let it burn policy or off-season prescribed burning to address the dead and down litter in low hazard areas in the state?
So if we look at the types of lands that the Oregon Department of Forestry protects, it's primarily private lands and some of the public lands there. We typically don't exercise any sort of let burn policy. Those areas where we can consider that as an option are typically federal lands, typically higher elevation places, and it's all a matter of doing the right thing at the right time of year under the right conditions. In terms of using prescribed fire in the other parts of the season, yes, certainly we're trying to proactively do that as much as we can to mitigate fuels, reduce fuels in those cases, and that gives us that tool to basically apply fire on the landscape under the controlled conditions that we want, so that we can kind of keep that under control where the smoke's going. You're always going to have a smoke issue with fire, but it gives us those opportunities to pick the conditions where we can mitigate any impacts of smoke to the public and things of that nature. So we're going to proactively continue to work on that. But in terms of kind of the let burn policy, you're not going to see that within the Department of Forestry.
That's right. What is the mitigation strategy for the power infrastructure caused fires that have proven to be the most destructive over the last 2 years?
I don't see anybody jumping up, so the conversations I've had with local power providers have been them trying to gain a better understanding about the highlight of conditions or those peak conditions when they get concerned about compromise in their power system that can start a fire. And so we've seen this in California. I don't believe we have seen it in Oregon, where they've actually started doing essentially rolling shutdowns of the power grid in extreme situations where there's high winds and high probability of a fire start, where they'll essentially shut down the power grid so that if a line doesn't come down, it'll start a fire. So, reflecting back on my 3 decades with the agency here, and I've been on a number of power line caused fires, not necessarily with the line coming down. It's more about a tree coming into the line or something else coming into the line. And so once again, that's a big conversation. Lots of other agencies in the state involved in that conversation about what are the trade-offs there about keeping your power system up and running when you've got real hazardous conditions out there.
Daniel, this one's for you. They specified you. Does the current state budget situation and the lack of action by the legislature affect the efforts to evaluate fire risk conditions statewide and plan for mitigation, as was done near Klamath Falls?
So the answer is we've had great success down there thanks to a wonderful group of partners. But Carrie, I'm going to give it back to you because I believe it's alluding to the fire program, your fire program. So you're best to speak about that. Do you want to go ahead and talk about how that fire program will extrapolate those efforts out and what's been funded and not?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we are currently underway hiring the fire program team. I've been the only one hired on so far. We're looking to hire a state fire specialist and 6 regional fire specialists that will be strategically placed across the state of Oregon. You know, we'll have somebody in Southwest Oregon, we'll have somebody specific for the rangelands, and so on. And so, yes, you know, we have to be mindful of budget cuts to the university and things like that. So there could be some shift in that staffing, but you know, for the most part, we'll get those people out there. I hope to have them, the team on board by this summer. maybe July or August, and they'll go to their service areas, they'll connect with their partners, they'll talk to you all, they'll do a needs assessment, they'll figure out what is the most pressing, and then, you know, thanks to Daniel and his partners in Klamath and Lake counties, there's this wonderful publication and framework for landscape scale cross-boundary projects and education and outreach that we hope to extrapolate across the state where appropriate. And so Daniel's group has been really successful by finding outside grant money through the Joint Chiefs program and other sources of funding. So money comes from all different angles for getting the work done on the ground. But in terms of the fire program, we're set in place to be those facilitators of bringing the people together to get the work done on the ground. And then what I've done here for you today, providing education and outreach. So I hope that answers that. And Daniel, if there's anything you'd like to add.
Well, no, that Carrie's team then, the fire program team, will evaluate fire risk and address mitigation across the state. So the legislature has funded that, and she'll manage it and carry it forward.
Yep. So I'm going to read this as is. I'm not really sure about this comment, but it's they give a web address. It's the blueforestconservation.com. Could a forest resilience bond be a source of funding for prescribed burns to reduce fuels? Seems it's better to be proactive than reactive. Not sure if you all right know about this. Does anybody know about the resilience bond?
I am not familiar with that.
Okay.
So the Forest Service looked into that a little while ago and found the pieces didn't seem to fit. Not that it's going to be cast aside, but we're constantly looking for grant funding and funding opportunities, and the Blue Forest Conservation Group was one source to look into. We're not giving it up yet, but it has potential, but we need to line some pieces together first. But you're right, it's always better to be proactive. Always better to be proactive than reactive.
That's right.
Like Kristen was saying.
Yeah, yep. My property backs up to a commercial clear cut. They are actively finishing up hauling out the timber. There's feet of debris left behind. Are they required to clear their lands? They must mean clear the debris piles. If so, how long do they have to get it done?
So that's a fairly common question we get, and there's basically kind of two different sides of that. If it's a clear cut and they're required to replant that area under the Oregon Forest Practices Act, they have to at least initiate some sort of activity within 1 year. Then they have to have the trees planted within 2 years of the finish of that operation. There are some areas of the state where we have some tools from a fire prevention mechanism where essentially we can instruct landowners that they need to mitigate something, and if not, they have to basically buy out of it, and then we'll use that money for additional resources ourselves. Not knowing exactly where this is at, I can tell you a common practice amongst most of the industrial forest landowners is to do something throughout the summer months with slash there. Typically, you'll see a lot of piling done of slash, and that'll mitigate some of that borderline hazard there that might exist in that situation. And then those piles are either covered or left until fall after it's wet, and then they'll burn those in. So there is that kind of the condition that'll persist through the summer, but from a reforestation standpoint, they've got a year to get that going.
Mm-hmm. And my apologies, you guys, I'm so engrossed in the conversation that I realized we're 9 minutes after 11. And so the webinar was supposed to end at 11. However, the speakers said that they would stay on and answer questions till 11:15. So I'm sorry for that if I've kept you on the line longer than you had hoped, but the conversation is so good. I do want to point your attention to, I'm sharing this slide here about next week's fire behavior and the home ignition zone, Friday, May 15th from 1 to 2. If you want, and this is kind of neat, and I'm not that great with technology, so I'm just kind of learning about it. I knew of the QR codes, but if you have a cell phone, an iPhone that can take pictures, just simply click on your camera icon and just, like you're taking a picture. You don't even have to take a picture of that QR code, and then it brings up the website right for you. So you can just point your camera at the screen and look at that QR code, and then the website will pop up, and that will give you information on the upcoming webinars and other information too. So I just wanted to point your attention to that. We have just a couple more questions, so if folks wanted to hang on, please do. We'll be online here for another 5 minutes. Will contract firefighter companies need to have a plan in place for COVID to get dispatched or help to get dispatched?
So I'll try that one as well, I guess. We're still developing those plans, and I think there's going to be some requirements of contract firefighting crews this summer around PPE, around social distancing, and around basically that module concept I talked about, where we keep one crew together. They're not, interchanging crew members every shift and that sort of thing, to help mitigate that potential exposure or spread of the disease like that. I think that's going to get lined out here. I'm expecting, we're going to have all that information out to our contract firefighters and all the other resources here soon. We also rely on inmate labor quite a bit for hand crews, and those same things are going to apply to those folks there. So it's no big secret that here in Oregon and across the West, their contract firefighting resources are the key to large fire and initial attack support. Without those folks, we can't do our work. And so we need to keep them safe, but we also need to give them the ability to help us out in those situations.
Great. Well, I think that's it for questions. Let me just check the chat. Just a lot of thank yous coming in. Thank you for the presentation. See you next week. Okay, so, well, that does it. We've answered all the questions. Presenters, thank you so much. All that information was fantastic, from what is the problem to what's going on in Oregon to what we can do to help prevent wildfires and to help keep Oregon green. Like I said, I'll be emailing you. Yes, I will be emailing you resources, including the Keep Oregon Green website, the Oregon Department of Forestry website, the fire program website, and that great publication on fire-resistant plants, and any other thing I can think of to give you for resources. Thank you so much for tuning in on this Friday morning. It looks to be a beautiful day. Stay safe out there. Take care of yourselves, and we'll hopefully see you all next week.
Carrie, thank you for organizing it. Thank you for the opportunity.
Absolutely, Daniel.
Take
Thanks,
care.
Mike. Thanks, Kristen.
Bye-bye.
Bye.